So I'm here with Buddy Powell, and it's May of 2014. Welcome, Buddy.
Well, thanks. Glad to be here today.
And one of the things about you that I've always been intrigued by is that you were there kind of at the beginning of scientific studies of manatees in Florida. And I wonder if you could sort of set the scene for those that aren't familiar with your story and give us a feeling for how you got started in your interest with manatees.
Sure. Well, I grew up in Crystal River on the west coast of Florida, which is now the mecca for manatees, as we know. And back then I was a teenager. This was in the late 1960s, so I was 14 or 15 years old. And I always had a strong interest in the water. I was out snorkeling and scuba diving and interested in whatever was out there. And so back then people really didn't even know that manatees were in the river, even many of the locals that lived there. And I was working in a dive shop at that time, the only one in Crystal River, called Aqua Pier, which is no longer there. And on the wall there were all these photographs of manatees, and there was a graduate student, Daniel Hartman from Cornell, who came down and sort of doing a whole reconnaissance of Florida, trying to figure out where he would do his PhD work. And when he went into that dive shop, he noticed these underwater photographs of manatees, and so I think that probably cemented it for him that Crystal River would be a great place to do his PhD research. So that was all unbeknownst to me at the time. I was just a kid out on the water with an interest in wildlife and things aquatic. And so being out there every day, I noticed this guy who was obviously out of place in little small Crystal River, which at that time was mainly just a fishing town. Some tourism, but mainly based on fishing. And there was this guy that had longish hair and was standing up in a little john boat, which you don't do if you know anything about boats. And he didn't have a fishing pole, and he didn't have a can of beer, so he didn't belong there. And he was always looking out over the water with a pair of binoculars. And so I'd see him out practically every day I was there. And so finally I got enough courage to go up and talk to him. And he was eyeing my boat, because he had this little Sears and Roebuck john boat with a 3 horsepower motor or something.
Oh.
And I had a boat that could take me about 20 minutes to get down the river, and it'd take him about 3 hours. So I think that's the only reason he tolerated me, is because he really wanted my boat. And my dad paying for the gas. So he fulfilled for me an interest in learning and wanting to know more about the river, and he got access to a local guide, me, and my boat, and so it worked out really well, and we actually became very close friends, and I ended up being his, I'd like to call assistant, but it was probably more his sidekick than anything. and as he was doing his research, I just became very passionate about it myself, and every weekend and every spare hour I was out there with him, or helping collect data and doing the sort of photo identification, sketching the scars of manatees and getting to know each one individually. So that's what started it.
Okay.
And then after he left to write up, the Cousteaus sent down someone to sort of, they read an article that he had written in National Geographic, and they said this might be the topic of a documentary, and so they sent a couple people to come and look at the possibility, and so Hartman told them to get a hold of me, so I took them out, and as a consequence, they left very excited about it, and then the Cousteaus came
Mm-hmm.
To do the documentary, and Hartman and myself, same thing, sort of help guide them around. And so one thing just sort of
Yeah.
turned into another.
Now, what year? Do you remember what year the Cousteau thing?
Yeah, that was in the early '70s. So that was in '71, I think.
Okay. So this leads into my next question, which is, as you know, Woody went on from there to testify before Congress when they were having hearings related to the pending legislation known as the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Do you remember what your thoughts and feelings were about that legislation and the efforts to protect marine mammals? Was this on your radar at the time?
It was and it wasn't. I mean, remember that I was at that time, it was like in
73.
72.
Well, the hearings would have been in 72.
Yeah, and I remember him going to those hearings, and I remember talking to him about it. But I was a high school senior going into my freshman year of college, and so there were a number of things that were of interest to me. But what it did do is that it made me realize, how important this species, and opened up my understanding of endangered and threatened species and the need for their protection. I didn't really realize at the time the scope of it all, because back in the '60s, in fact, I have a newspaper clipping. Hartman and I proposed to the county government in Citrus County to have Crystal River declared a sanctuary. And I think this was like in '67 or '68, and the county commission at the time denied it. Said, thought it was a bad idea because it'd have a negative economic impact on the local community.
The fishing and so forth.
Yeah, which of course now we know the main driver in the wintertime in particular are manatees. It's now becoming that. So those were sort of the preliminaries, and I was beginning to understand the importance of protected areas for these endangered species. So what that did is it changed the whole dynamics of the approach to conservation of manatees. And for me personally, it had an important impact, because what it did, it was, after the Endangered Species Act and Marine Mammal Protection Act, is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service then began a long-term research project on manatees. And so they started this project in Gainesville, the Sirenia project, which you know very well, in the mid-'70s. And I was in college at the time, and so when they started, same thing, they got a hold of Hartman, and Hartman, because they were looking for someone with experience on manatees, Duke Campbell and Blair Irvine, and so they got a hold of my mom in Crystal River and said, he's over in school at Stetson, get a hold of him. And so they came over to DeLand, which is near Blue Springs, which is another sanctuary, warm water sanctuary for manatees. And at that time, it wasn't even a state park. And they hired me, so I ended up working, one of the original employees for that
for Sirenia project
while still at college at Stetson. And then later, I moved to Gainesville in a number of years.
So you mentioned Blue Spring. Did your work involve animals at Blue Spring at that time?
Yeah.
Okay.
So back when Hartman was there, and I was still in high school, we went over, and primarily Woody, began collecting some of that initial information on those Blue Springs animals. And then the Cousteaus did some of their filming there. And then as a student project when I was at Stetson, so now maybe 3 years had gone by, I would go out collecting some of the, following and monitoring those animals in Blue Springs. And then when I was hired by Fish and Wildlife Service, I was doing it for them. And at that time, I was lettering the animals from A to Z, not really naming them, except some that had been named before. And I didn't even get up to Z. So there was less than 26 manatees using Blue
Wow.
Springs at the time, when it wasn't a state park. And
Yeah.
then some of that data, and then also the momentum that was built by the Cousteau program led to Blue Springs becoming a state park. But at least we had several years worth of data to be able to show the importance of that particular site.
Now, Buddy, you mentioned when we were talking just a few minutes ago about scar patterns on manatees that you and Woody had documented in Crystal River in the late 60s, let's say. Did you both have a sense that there was a problem with boats hitting manatees? I mean, was that something that you were aware of at that time?
Yeah, I mean, we knew that many of the manatees were scarred by boat scars, and Hartman, in his dissertation and also in his monograph, mentioned the number of strikes and the non-lethal injuries. But that was before we really began collecting carcasses, manatees that had been killed.
Yeah.
So the degree that, or having some perspective as far as how many manatees were actually being killed as compared to being injured, didn't really have that information yet.
Yes.
And that wasn't until the Sirenia project began collecting, and Dan Odell down in Miami began collecting carcasses. That's the big difference now, is as time has gone on, and more information and more answers lead to more questions, is that it's become more specialized, which is absolutely fabulous. And from my perspective, and I'm sure yours too, is over the years we've speculated about a lot of things, and now there are young scientists, emerging scientists, and students that are pursuing many of these questions and answering them.
Giving
Of course,
them answers.
that's right, and it's wonderful. It's absolutely fabulous, and that was kind of taking it one step back again. One of the wonderful things about Hartman's original study is that he did make a number of sort of general statements and suggestions that he really didn't have a lot of data for.
Yeah.
But I'll be damned, he was right on. He's for a lot of it, and as time has gone on, and we've been able to collect that information,
Right.
data. So that's the difference now, is that people are becoming much more specialized in their particular field of interest, and that in itself is broadening our knowledge about this particular endangered species, and every day it's almost another fascinating new thing that we are learning about them, whether the work that you and your students and colleagues have been involved with, the hares and the sensory adaptations. And for example, one of the manatees that I photographed in Crystal River back in the 1970s, a female, well, she ended up in Cuba when I happened to be in Cuba. So how are these, and we're doing some tagging studies in Belize, and there are manatees out on Turnef Coral Atoll, which is across deep blue oceanic water.
Wow.
And our tagging data, we didn't know whether they were residents out there or what, but they're going back and forth across this deep blue water with strong currents in between. And you look at the tag, and they're, it's almost like they have a GPS that they can hit that one cut in the reef, and then they'll hit another point on the other side between crossing, and they're making these multiple crossings. So how are they, this is an animal that we think is an inshore species. How are they able to navigate these open oceanic water? And so as we learn more, we have more and more questions about they're much There's a lot we have to learn, and that's where it's going to take directed efforts and great studies and more time to be able to figure
Now,
out.
you just mentioned, Cuba and Belize. Can you, and I know, many people that know that you've been involved in international things having to do with manatees for a long time. Can you give us your perspective on the efforts and the value of those efforts in places other than Florida to look at manatees in the Caribbean and South America, and what you've gotten out of it as in terms of those relationships and those interactions, and what you see for the future of that, for example, in Cuba, maybe?
Sure, yeah. And my career has taken a direction of being more of a conservation biologist, which is really fulfilling in many respects, because you're first off, when you're dealing with an animal that you're knowledgeable about and passionate about its survival, is that your hope is that what you're doing, in addition to the science, is also contributing in a way to the protection of that species. And so that goes along with not only that knowledge base, in order to be able to better protect species, you've got the science behind it, but also it's people based as well. And so that's the other very fulfilling aspect about this career, which is you can leave a number of different types of legacy. One is the science and the information that you hopefully contribute to, but the other is the people that remain in these countries, or students in your own country or wherever, who continue the work on.
Right.
And that's very fulfilling, and as compared to many years ago, where there was just very few, a very small number of individuals involved with manatee biology and conservation. There are now many, as we've seen. These workshops and so forth just continue to grow more and more. But the problems faced for the survival of manatees outside of Florida is very different. Where manatees in Florida are practically an urban species, with all the development we have around the state, you find manatees in Miami River, and people's canals, and they interact, with them. But they also have to contend with all of these changes in their habitat, and direct threats and indirect threats. Where in many of these other countries where manatees are more typically found, they're primarily, as you know, a tropical species, and in places where the habitat is still relatively untouched, they're still hunted in many of these areas. And we can, in a more affluent society like our own, we can afford to have manatees there in many ways for if you will, our own purposes, besides consuming them. We can have them there for future generations and their role in the ecology and all those other important aspects. But in these other countries, particularly in places where they are protein starved, it's difficult to tell a fisherman who can barely eke out a living that he can't take advantage of this big hunk of red meat that just swam by his boat. And so the challenges to conserving these animals and the ethics of it, and our transferring our cultural viewpoints to other places is like I said before, a challenging, sometimes very difficult. And as a conservation biologist, you're faced with sort of trying to find that balance, and whether it's trying to find alternative sources of income or alternative sources of protein, but trying to reduce these threats, particularly in some places hunting, which is very severe for a low an animal that has a lower reproductive rate, is where it becomes particularly important to have people within those countries doing it.
Right.
Because to come in from the outside and try to impose something is going to be met with potentially resistance or perhaps a lack of understanding of the complexity of it all, the dynamics. And so having worked in many different countries, it's very, very important to be able to build up that critical number of individuals that will be able to continue what is going to be a very long-term prospect in terms of.
What sort of advice do you have for a young person that has become fascinated by marine mammals, let's say, or maybe manatees in particular, and they are trying to figure out what kind of career can I make out of this? What sort of opportunities and things would you advise them to try to engage in order to find out what the possibilities are, maybe volunteering, internships, those kind of things? I mean, what sort of things do you see that are the kind of ways you would advise somebody to spend their time effectively in trying to build themselves a career?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Back when we were all generalists and running around the state trying to pick up carcasses and do anything and everything we possibly could, it was a very different situation than it is now. Now there are a lot of students who are graduating from universities and so forth, certainly with the academic credentials to get into this field, but they very often lack two things. One is previous experience and recommendations sometimes. The other is focus, which is great. I mean, people are very curious about things in general, and the other is some very practical skills. So I guess what I would do is recommend that if young people are interested in this career, is to search out opportunities to volunteer, and so that they gain some experience, and they may very early find out that it's not all sitting around in boats watching whales. That right outside here there's a couple girls scraping barnacles off the bottom of a boat.
Right.
If you know. So there's another aspect of it, and that's it's all part of it.
Right.
And they find out that maybe this is not exactly what I want to do. But if not, if they're able to follow their passion and follow their interests, is to gain that experience through volunteering or internships. That gives you the experience that goes along with your academics when it comes time to look at a career. The other is, we can't afford to be generalists anymore. Is to really think about what your particular interest is, and try to get some experience if you can, or research it more and come up with sorts of questions that in your own mind you would like to have answered. So you're following your own sense of curiosity and wonder as you go into your science. And then the other, this sounds crazy, but I'll give you a personal experience. When I was an undergrad at University of Florida, I was asking my advisor at the time, because I wanted to go off and do field biology and so forth. So I was asking him for advice for what courses I should take. And he had spent a number of years in Africa, And so I thought he'd say, oh, you need to take statistics or you need to take whatever. He says, well, I'd take auto mechanics and make sure you know how to type and make sure you get some medical training. Well, he's right, because those are the real life skills that go hand in hand with your, your academics, that it can make or break it if you're out there in the field and you can't fix your boat and you can't fix your car. So my point being is, if I have a candidate in front of me who has good academics and some experience, and I'm thinking about whether I'm going to send he or she, particularly at this early point, out in a boat in some remote area, or maybe even off to a foreign country, and they come back to me and say, oh yeah, I've taken a boater's safety course, or I grew up around boats, and if I feel it increases my confidence that not only they're going to be able to do what it is that they're going to do, but also just their safety and so forth. So that's my other advice, is get some real life skills under your belt too, because they will set you apart from other potential candidates.